Okay, so we saw that begin play is an event that gets fired off at the beginning of the game. As soon as the play button is hit, then begin play happens, and this actually happens for each individual actor. So we have one instance of our my actor here in the world, and we can actually drag in another one. And now that there's two in the world, if we hit play, you'll see that each one of these has its own begin play called, and each one of those prints hello world and hello universe to the screen. So we get twice as many messages printed to. So this shows you that each individual actor gets its own event begin play called at the beginning of every game. And so that's very useful to know. And if we want, we can really see the effect of this by duplicating these a few times. And just to show you another easy way to create copies of objects, if we go ahead and select one of these cones, you can hold down on the Alt key and click on one of these arrows and drag it out, and you'll see that we've actually duplicated this cone. And you can do this by selecting multiple objects. If I select two cones, hold down Alt and drag on the green arrow, you'll see that we've duplicated both cones. And so this is a really quick way to duplicate objects. And if I take one of these and I hold Alt and I drag it out, and I release Alt so I still have this being dragged out. Say I want to drag it way off to the side there, I can hold down on the Shift key and drag, and the camera will follow along with these items, and so that way I can drag things that are selected. So if I go ahead and take just a single cone, for example, and I'm not duplicating it, I'm just dragging around, I can hold the Shift key and the camera will follow along with that. So just a couple other maneuvering tricks for you. But all of that just to duplicate a bunch of these, and just remember that each of these is a my actor, and each of them will have its own begin play get called. So if I hit play, you'll see now we have a whole bunch of hello worlds and hello universes printed to the screen because each one of these individually has its own begin play function called. So I just wanted to do that to drive the point home that whatever you program in begin play for a particular actor, just know that every instance of that actor in the world will have its own begin play called. And so this can multiply whatever's happening here. So you need to be careful to only put things that you need to happen here, because just know every single cone, every single my actor in your world will call that functionality. So that is begin play. So that's one type of event, but there are very, very many different types of events, and begin play is just one of the most common that we're going to use. Another is this event tick here. And so if you drag this event tick over here, we're going to see how this works. An event tick is something that is sort of like begin play in that whatever is connected to it will get called, but it will be called every frame, and that's sometimes referred to as every tick. Now remember, we were looking at frames per second, and we saw that when I showed the FPS, it was showing something like 80 to 90 or 100 frames per second. That means that this simulation is being updated 100 times or 90 times per second, which is very, very rapidly. And tick gets called every frame. So if your frames per second is 90, then this function or this event gets fired off 90 times per second. And we can see this, the effects of this, by taking a print string node. So for example, we can break this so it doesn't get called in begin play, and break this wire and just bring the hello world down here and connect it to the event tick. So now event tick is connected to print string, and it's no longer grayed out because it's actually being used. Now hello world will be printed to the screen every single frame, and so if we go back and hit play, you'll see that it's printing a whole bunch of them, and it's actually doing that as many times per second as tick gets called, which is a lot. So so that's event tick, and this is for things that you want happening very rapidly every frame, and so this should be used sparingly. This should very, very rarely be used because it gets very expensive when you have things hooked up to event tick. And so this is one of those things that can really slow down your game and make your frames per second get really low, and it'll look like the performance is taking a hit. So this is important to keep down to a minimum. Now you'll notice that event tick has an additional thing coming out of it, and it's green, and it's delta seconds. So delta seconds is the amount of time passed between last frame and this frame. So delta seconds can vary depending on what's happening in your game and how much processing power your game uses, because that will alter the frames per second and alter your performance. And so therefore delta seconds is necessary so that you can know how much time has passed between last frame and this frame. So delta seconds is a particular data type. Now we know already about one type of data type, and that's the string. The string is a series of characters, like hello world is the sort of contents of a string. And a float, if you hover over this green, float is a particular type of number, and that is basically any number that has a decimal representation. So if it's a number like 1.125, that would be a float, or 1.0 or 10.5. These are all numbers that have a decimal point in them, and that is in computer data type terminology known as a float data type. And so delta seconds is known as a float. Now, if we drag this out, you'll see that it's a green wire, and that's because this wire represents a float data type. And if we drag it into the string, you'll see that if we let go, we get this automatic node that converts this from a float to a string. So a float is not the same as a string of characters. It's a different type of data, and the computer sees that as a different type, but it can be converted to a string. And basically what it's doing is converting this from a number into the character equivalent of that number. And that way it can be sent into the print string as a message. So basically you have whatever is going into this in string, that's what's going to get printed through the print string node. And if there's nothing there, if I hold Alt and click and break this execution wire, then whatever's in this box is just the default value for what will be printed to the screen. But if something comes into it, then it will take that data that's flowing in through that wire and print that to the screen instead. So if I come back and hit play, you'll see that now every frame we're getting the delta time value printed to the screen, and this is showing you how much time in seconds is passing between the frames, and it's changing slightly, but you'll see that it's 0.0166 and some other numbers, and that shows you just how many numbers, or rather just how many seconds are passing between frames. And so this little node is sort of an automatic thing that the engine does for you to convert from a float to a string. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to break that, and I'm going to show you a new concept now known as variables. And in the variables section here, you'll see that if we hover over variables, we can hit the plus and we can create a new variable, and its name is automatically highlighted here. And I'm going to rename this one, and I'm going to call this string to print. Oops. And if you call it the wrong thing, you can click on it again and rename it and fix your typos. So string to print is a new variable that we've just created and added here. And you'll see with this new variable selected over here to the right, we have its own details panel, and you can change its name here as well. And you can also see that it has its own type, and if we click the drop down here, we have a bunch of different types to choose from. And you'll see that float is one of them, and it's of course light green, just like it is here in the event graph. And you'll see that all the different types are color coded so that you can tell what data type it is just by looking at its color here in the event graph. And we can choose to have our variable have any type that we can select here. And I'm going to select string, and that will automatically change its color to pink because string types are pink by color coding. And so if I change this to string, now I have a new variable of type string. And a variable is sort of like something that can hold information. So if I take this variable, I can actually drag it in. And if I drag it in and release, you'll see I have two different options, get string to print and set string to print. Now if I click get string to print, then we have a little node here that is representing the string to print. And if I drag it out and I say get string to print, then it looks more like a function. And this is, it has an input execution pin and an output execution pin, and it also has an input for string to print. And this is how we can change the contents of string to print. And we're going to get to basically using these later on, so don't feel overwhelmed just yet, because we're going to use these in detail. But just so you know, our variable is a thing that we can drag in as its own node here in the editor. So again, if I drag it in and click get string to print, it's basically its own node with a value that we can access, and in these little colored circles represent data type values. So if I drag off of string to print and hover over in string, you'll see that this variable can be fed into print string, and now print string is going to access the contents of this string variable and print those to the screen. Now, what contents does it have? Well, we can give it a default value to hold in this variable. And if we look at the details value, the details panel, down here by default value, you'll see it says, please compile the blueprint. So we cannot give it a default value until we compile the blueprint. So if we go up here to compile, we'll click on compile, and now you'll see the default value has a text box, and we can enter in some default value for our string. And so if we want to put a message in here, we can say message to print. Now our print variable, our string to print variable, has a default value, so now the contents of this string are the message that we put here. So now why don't we go ahead and click compile and go back and hit play, and you'll see that now message to print is printed to the screen, because that is what our variable holds by default. So this is very nice. This is a way to basically store information in the form of a variable, and then we can use that in nodes that take particular variable types. And so because this variable is of type string, it's already compatible with the input parameter variable type, and so no conversion is necessary. So that's how we get a variable and use it for our node. So let's hold Alt and let's break that connection, and let's get our print to string variable, and let's just drag it down here for now. And I'm going to show you now how to set this string variable. So if we string to print and release, we'll see set string to print, and now we see that we need to use the input and output execution pins similar to a function. And so we can drag this up here, and just off of event tick we can drag the input execution pin, or rather the output execution pin, into the input execution pin, and you'll see that it automatically breaks the connection to print string, and that's because the output execution pin for a node must go in one direction only. It cannot split into two different directions, because the flow of control can only go in one direction and do one thing at a time. So if we want to set print string to print, we have to do that, and then whatever we want to do after that, for example, call print string, then we can do it after, and only one thing can be done at a time. And so what set print string to print does is it changes the value of the contents of the string. So even though string to print has message to print inside of it, we can use this node to change that. So if we take string to print, and in here for the little box we can say changed value in all caps, this node here effectively will change the contents of string to print to changed value. So now if I right click and drag around, I can move around in here. If I take string to print, move it over here, and I drag its value into the node for print string, I can come back and hit play, and now you'll see that it no longer has the default value that we set. It now says changed value thanks to our set node here. However, if we break these and we drag the pin from tick straight over to print string and we skip the set node, then the set node never gets called, and we can come back and hit play and we'll see that it just prints the default value. So the default value is going to be what string to print is, the value that it holds, unless we change it, and set is one way to change that. Now, if we hold Alt and we break this execution pin and drag it down here, we'll see that this set node also has an output execution pin of type string. See, it's pink, so we know it's of type string. And that is a way to access the contents of the string variable after we've changed it. So if we drag that straight into the print string node, then we no longer need this string to print node. We can delete that, and now print string will get the contents of string to print and use that. So we can go back, hit play, and we'll see that it's using changed value. So that is one way to change a variable's value. Another way is to drag a value into it. For example, we've got this delta seconds. It's converted by this conversion node here into a string. If we drag that value into the set node, now we're changing the value to what this conversion node is returning. It's returning the value of delta seconds converted to a string type. So if we hit play, now we see that it's back to the delta time, the delta seconds. So there are different ways to use the set node. One is to type in the actual value, and another is to drag in the a wire of the correct data type, and that will be passed in, and that will set the value and overwrite that value with whatever that value is being passed in. So one last thing that we're going to do before we conclude this is we're going to use a very interesting and very useful manipulation node, and that is to append to a string. So if we right click and we type append, and we see under the string category this append function, if we click on that, we'll see that we have this new node called append. And so what this node does is it takes some input value of string type and some output value, or another input value of string type. So it's got two inputs. It will add those two together and return a new string value that is the sum of the two together. So let's just show in a very basic way how this works. If I take the A and I type in first and then a space bar, and then if I take the B and type in second, then what this append will do is construct a new string, and its return value will be the first one plus the second. So if I take the return value and bring it into the set node for set string to print, and I connect up the event tick, then we'll see that this append value is being passed in. So we're setting string to print to whatever is returned by append, and what's returned by it is, the first thing appended with the second. So if we go back and hit play, we'll see first, second, because it's appending these two things. Now this is useful if we want to construct a string with different things on it. For example, for the first one, I can type delta seconds with a colon and a space bar, and I'm going to hit enter. And then for the second thing, I'm going to drag in the result from this conversion node. So it's going to take that delta seconds string and append it to the end of this delta seconds message here. And what's returned, we'll see if we go and hit play, is it'll say delta seconds and then that second thing that was appended to the string. So appending is basically adding two strings together. And so that's a very useful way to use this print string to print some debug messages to the screen and give them labels. And in that way, you'll see that basically you can take multiple strings, connect them together, and their return type can be used to set any variable. Now, of course, we could get around using this variable altogether by breaking all these nodes, all of these wires, and just taking the results of the append node and dragging that value straight into print string, and then with event tick connected to print string, we can go back and hit play, and we get the same result. So we can do the same thing without even using variables, but we can use variables if we want to as well. So there are multiple ways to do things, and I'm just going through these different ways just to show you that there are different ways, and that variables are something you need to know how to create. So they're as easy as just clicking on the plus and adding a new variable. And you'll see that when I've added a new variable, its type is pink because it remembers the last type that I used, the last variable that I created, and it'll automatically create a new variable of that same type. And of course, if you've created a new variable that you don't want, you can click it to highlight it, hit the delete key, and you will delete that variable and you'll no longer have it. So that is event tick. That is also how you create a new variable, and also you've learned the difference between different types because each variable has its own type as indicated by its color. So types are color coded, and the float variable type, which is a decimal number, is light green, and the string data type is pink. And you'll know when you look at basically logic depicted by these nodes that if you see something color coded, if it's pink, you'll know that it's a string right off the bat. But of course, you can always hover over these nodes and you'll see that it shows you that it is a string. If you hover over the green, you'll see that it is a float. And so everything is really easy. If you forget the color coding, just hover over and you'll see the data type.